Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth lecture by Professor Don S. Browning in his series Psychology, Spirituality, and Psychotherapy Toward a Revived Religious Humanism. The lecture series is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology in the Danielsen Institute under a grant by the Meta-Nexus Institute of the Templeton Foundation. I'm Robert Neville, the director of the Danielsen Institute and professor of philosophy, religion, and theology at Boston University. Don Browning is the Alexander Campbell Professor Emeritus of Ethics and the Social Sciences at the University of Chicago Divinity School, where he took his own PhD. Professor Browning is the author of a very great many books and articles. I listed most of them in my introduction to the previous lectures, and you can look them up on the internet if you want to find them. His book, A Fundamental Practical Theology, defined the field for his time, as Schleiermacher did for his time. Professor Browning has written on the interface of psychology, spirituality, and theology since the beginning of his career, and the topic of these lectures has been a lifelong interest. Most recently, he has developed collaborative research in religious matters to a high art, completing a very well-funded multidisciplinary project on the family. The collaborative project at Boston University, of which this lecture series is a part, owes much to Don Browning by way of precept and example. Professor Browning's lectures have been or soon will be placed on the internet and can be accessed through Boston University's BU Universe or through the Danielsen Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology. 3 lectures were given last month in October, and this afternoon the lecture is entitled Religion, Science, and the New Spirituality. Please return this evening to this place for a lecture entitled Mental Health and Spirituality, Their Institutional Embodiments. And please come back tomorrow evening for the final lecture in the series, Institutional Ethics and Families, Therapy, Law, and Religion. Now, please join me in welcoming Don Browning to lecture on religion, science, and the new spirituality.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for the invitation to come here and deliver these lectures. I must admit that in my stage in life, lectures like this serve the function of pulling odds and ends of your work together as you also try to probe in new directions. So it's been an opportunity for me to think about the past, the present, and the future, and I've enjoyed and I think profited from the opportunity to do this, and I thank you very much. Religion, Science, the New Spirituality, you heard the title. What has the dialogue between science and religion contributed to the recent cultural interest in spirituality? And what has the scientific study of spirituality contributed to our understanding of how to define it? In response to these questions, I will advance a thesis. The scientific study of spiritual transformation has tended to give us a much more inner-worldly view of spirituality. This new spirituality tends to be built around the importance of human connections, family, loved ones, friendships, work, and practical judgments or practical reason. There is a transcendent dimension to many of the current spiritualities, but is one that both reinforces, generally, and sometimes relativizes these more earthly goods. The new spirituality, however, may be undermining the remainder of a more medieval two-spirit view of spirituality, a view perhaps best exemplified, but not limited, to Roman Catholicism. This older view distinguished between a higher, otherworldly ethical spirituality and a this worldly spirituality of the laity. It might be argued that science has interacted with a more distinctively Protestant view that challenges the distinction between lay and clerical spirituality, and saw spirituality more in terms of various vocations of life. One can see evidence of this new spirituality in the emphasis on eudaimonism, or human flourishing, in the Science of Religion and Spirituality writings of philosopher Owen Flanagan, the Positive Psychology of Jonathan Haidt, the work on character of Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson, and the research on the connection of sociality, health, and spirituality, and the research on loneliness by John Cacioppo. One also can see this new emphasis on the importance of human connections in family and friendships, as well as work and vocation, in the commentary on New Directions of Roman Catholic Spirituality, put forward by Boston University scholar Claire Wolfdyke, who sits in this audience at this time. Much of recent Catholic spirituality has featured the needs of laypeople who live, love, and work in a practical world that encompasses both private and public spheres. She writes, embedded in debates about the meaning of politics, work, and family are deep spiritual questions. Work and family are primary spheres of lay action and responsibility, hence logical loci for spirituality. People often define themselves through their work and their family relationships, which become centers of meaning or centers of alienation. Wolfdyke sees another preoccupation of contemporary spirituality. This is a concern with the nature of practical reason. For laypersons to make judgments about the nature of their relationships and their work life, they must exercise practical wisdom. If their spirituality is to help them, Wolfdyke believes it must also inform their practical reason in making decisions in both their public and their private worlds. She writes, if the religious person is to engage faith with work in the public sphere, then he or she must be guided by discernment. Laity must make choices in their private relationships at work and public responsibilities. If they are to be a leaven in the world, then they must daily make practical judgments consistent with this mission. It is important, then, to think through the relationship between faith and practical reason. It is my view that the science-religion dialogue and the social trends influencing contemporary spirituality are giving rise to a revived religious humanism. You've heard me develop that thesis in past lectures, where transcendence and tradition are being searched for their relevance to the challenges of human relationships, work life, and practical reason needed to guide these concerns. In addition to the influence of science on spirituality, there's been a strong pressure from the forces of modernization and secularization to give spirituality a more inner-worldly cast. Modernization, as sociologists and economists tell us, differentiates the social structures of society and introduces to the lives of us all multiple logics and patterns that are not easily accommodated by any particular inherited ethic, be it religious or secular. Lay people live very complicated lives with many different demands from their economic, domestic, and political spheres of daily activity. It should not be surprising that they increasingly search for spiritualities that assist them in coping with these diverse demands. The situation and context of modernization itself, to which the Protestant Reformation was doubtless an early responder, has influenced our spirituality to become more this worldly and practical. You'll notice that I have mentioned the words situation and context. These were words introduced in Lecture 3 in connection with Paul Ricoeur's list of several steps of practical moral reflection and action. That was the last lecture about 3 weeks ago. According to him, not only is ethics born out of our teleological strivings for the goods of life, morally critiqued by what he calls the deontological tests, and enriched by inherited and classic practices and narratives, our moral thinking should return, he insists, to and address the original situation of our concrete ethical conflicts. There is a limited here we go. The move from ethics to morality must be complicated and completed by a return to the situation of the cyclicite. But the words situation and context open complex issues in contemporary discussions about morality, practical reason, and spirituality. Some social psychologists like to flash evidence before philosophers and theologians that suggests that nothing as sophisticated as Ricoeur's model actually guides our decisions in the real world. These psychologists claim that the pressures of the situation dictate our response more than we like to think. They insist that neither global character traits nor reliable moral deliberation truly guide humans when confronting the immediacy of moral and practical conflicts. Rather, as Kwame Appiah has summarized their arguments, many social psychologists believe people are more likely to be guided by systematic human tendencies to respond to features of their situations. And indeed, does this mean that to recognize the pressures of modernity and our images of spirituality might itself be an example of this situational pressure? There is a limited truth, I believe, to some social psychologists' emphasis on the influence of situations on moral and practical decisions and the spirituality that sometimes surrounds them. But it can be very easily overstated. Yes, under the pressure of social forces requiring rapid decisions, the power of situations is doubtless very significant. But many of our moral decisions or moral directions are more gradually arrived at in response to a series of situations or on the basis of a synthesis of more specific situations. This is why Kwame Appiah wisely points out human beings rely heavily on institutions. Institutions habituate and reinforce traditions of good decisions and make it possible for us to resist the pressures of immediate situations. Appiah's point is close to Ricoeur's view about how our inherited classic practices provide guides to both the tested good and the right. Appiah says it well when he agrees with philosopher Gil Harman that if we want to improve human welfare, we may do better to put less emphasis on moral education and on building character and more emphasis on trying to arrange social institutions so that human beings are not placed in situations to which they will act badly. It will be my argument that the new science of spiritual transformation plus the collective experiences of modernization can and should intentionally join with inherited traditions to give institutional form to a more interworldly spirituality, a spirituality that I have called a revived religious humanism. One might think that my claim that science has contributed to this interworldly spirituality, especially its possible institutionalization into a revived religious humanism, is something of a stretch. It might be easier to think that just the opposite is currently true. Robert Fuller's engaging book titled Spiritual but Not Religious summarizes a great deal of the current perception of the rise of spirituality in its more individualistic forms and, at the same time, the decline of institutional religion or institutional embodiments of spirituality. Much of the scientific study of spirituality mainly has to do with its effects on health and often uses rather thin measures of spirituality, such as frequency of prayer, church membership, church attendance, or belief in God, to do its work. Such interests and measures cast science as something of a wedge, disconnecting spirituality from its larger liturgical, moral, and communal and institutional settings. Research by neuroscientists such as Andrew Newberg has shown neural effects of meditation and alleged experiences of the transcendent, but seldom demonstrates interest in the full effects of the communal, liturgical, and religious way of life. In view of these trends, one might think that the evidence is to the contrary of my thesis that science is undermining an institutional form of spiritual life, whether humanistic or recognizably theistic. But there are other ways to look at this evidence. The very fact that hospitals and medical schools are now interested in the health consequences of spirituality, the very fact that there is a new worldwide movement of positive psychology and other disciplines that are comparing spiritualities, and the fact that religious institutions of all kinds, even today, often take account of this new information as they explain the value of their own ethics, doctrines, and liturgies, indicates to me that the scientific study of spiritual transformation is having an impact on institutional life, both religious and secular, and that in this way is giving support to a revived religious humanism with institutional form. Examples of the new science and how the new science is feeding this more inner-worldly spirituality are not difficult to find. I turn first to Jonathan Haidt, one of the leading figures in the new positive psychology. As we already have observed, Haidt, along with Chris Peterson and Martin Seligman, intentionally promote a dialogue between the world's traditions of spiritual wisdom and modern psychology. Haidt does not believe that modern psychology originates by itself insights into what makes human beings happy and flourishing. He claims that many of the present themes of positive psychology can be found in the great wisdom traditions of China, India, and the Mediterranean. It is quite clear, however, that Haidt feels positive psychology can sometimes refine these spiritualities, and in some cases actually correct them, as he tries to do with aspects of Stoic, Buddhist, and Christian spirituality. Implicitly, Haidt practices something like Ricoeur's dialectic of understanding, explanation, and understanding that I advocated in the first lecture. But as does much of positive psychology, he often short-circuits historical understanding and sometimes uses psychological explanations to make controversial normative judgments, but sometimes, I must add, with a degree of acuity. Haidt is interested in the category of happiness when discussing the spiritual ends of human beings. Not all spiritualities, however, gravitate to the idea of happiness. Protestant spirituality is more interested in salvation and justification than happiness as such. On the other hand, Roman Catholic spirituality synthesized the rubrics of Christian salvation and Greek happiness in its belief that the rational love of God was the fulfillment of both happiness and salvation. I should alert you that in my earlier defense in the second lecture of the Caritas view of love, in contrast to the strong agape or eros models, I was implicitly sympathetic with Roman Catholic syntheses of happiness and salvation. With this caveat in mind, I turn to examine how Haidt's science might influence spirituality in an inner-worldly direction. Implicitly, Haidt practices something like, you've done that? Oh. Haidt believes that happiness is associated with a rich life of human attachments and meaningful work. Hence, both similar to, but in ways far different from Freud, love and work are the two values that Haidt believes lead to flourishing and happiness and should be used to measure spiritualities. Earlier in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, he sets forth a formula for happiness. It goes like this: H, which means happiness, equal S, our inherited temperament set points. Kind of an interesting new idea developing in a variety of psychologies that we do have set points for contentment that are inherited and quite individual. So H equals S, our inherited temperament set point, plus C, conditions, plus V, voluntary activities. Haidt characterizes love and work as mainly external conditions to be organized into the category of C. He writes, love and work are, for people, obvious analogs to water and sunshine for plants. Haidt believes that the West has typically emphasized the external conditions needed for flourishing, and the East, especially Buddhism, more generally has accentuated internal voluntary attitudes and states of mind. Haidt thinks that both external conditions and internal attitudes are necessary for a healthy spirituality. He is, however, frankly critical of the spirituality of Buddhism for making too much of internal voluntary controlled attitudes, such as control of desire. But he is equally critical of the spirituality of Western agapic love, which he sees as abstract and does not fully understand the deep roles of human affections and attachments. In his criticism of both East and West, we can see that Haidt, like much of positive psychology, thinks the spiritual traditions of the world contained wisdom, but a wisdom not only desperately in need of the refinements of modern science, but also in need of the explanations and corrections of science as well. I have argued that Haidt and his positive psychological colleagues may be right that science can contribute refinements to a spiritual tradition. You've heard me develop that theme in a variety of the past lectures. But they often overstate their recommended refinements to the place that they become actual corrections of a spiritual tradition by science. Corrections that are often not fully informed. This happens because they do not commit sufficient effort to a full hermeneutical and historically nuanced understanding and retrieval of these complex traditions. Haidt has less to say about the importance of work for human flourishing than he does about attachments and love. But on this topic, however, he does discuss the work of the great animal researcher Harry Harlow. Harlow noticed that apes and monkeys seem to enjoy playing, solving problems, and causing things to happen just for the fun of it. They did these things without the imagined rewards or reinforcements that behaviorism posited. And he discusses the elegant theoretical work of Harvard psychologist Robert White, who argued that both psychoanalysis and behaviorism overlooked that people and many other mammals have a basic drive to make things happen. You can see it in the joy infants take with busy boxes, the activity centers that allow them to convert flailing arm movements into ringing bells and spinning wheels. Psychologists have referred to this basic need as a need for competence, industry, or mastery. White called it the affectance motive, which he defined as the need or drive to develop competence through interacting with and controlling one's environment. Haidt mentions research that shows a sense of affectance is enhanced by one's work, and if one's work permits a degree of occupational self-direction. And he acknowledges that one's work will be all the more meaningful if it is guided by a sense of calling or vocation. But he has little to say about what the great ideas of vocation and calling, more thoroughly elaborated by the theologians of the Protestant Reformation, actually mean and add to the psychobiological need for effectiveness. Haidt has much more to say about the other values he uses to judge world spiritualities, the values of human attachments, connections, and love. Haidt turns to the work of John Bowlby and his collaborator Mary Ainsworth that shows how important early attachments between mother and child are for later relationship formation, health, happiness, well-being, and even spirituality. Haidt agrees with John Cacioppo and William Patrick in their recent book titled Loneliness, Human Nature and the Need for Social Connections. People who have fewer social bonds and undergo the pain of loneliness also have poorer health, higher rates of suicide, more cognitive impairment, more alcoholism, and less reported satisfactions with life. Similarly, Haidt believes that having strong social relationships strengthens the immune system, extends life more, interestingly enough, than quitting smoking. That stretches my imagination a bit. Speeds recovery from surgery and reduces the risk of depression and anxiety disorders. He holds that the sociality played out in some spiritual communities enhance the human connections and their health-enhancing consequences. Haidt joins Bowlby in asserting that good childhood attachments between parents and children set young persons on the road toward better adult relationships, even a better chance for a healthy marriage. Haidt points out that in most mammals, there is little or no connection between parent-infant attachments and adult attachments between mates. For the most part, male mammals inseminate and leave the child care to the mother. Not so for human males, or at least up to the present age. Both human males and females typically repeat their childhood attachments to parents with their mates and form lasting bonds to care for their offspring, creating the institution of marriage, or at least some analog to it. The bonding between male and female at the human level, according to Haidt, is due to two quirks of evolution for Homo sapiens: the big brains and large heads of human infants and the narrow pelvis of the human female that also enables her ability to walk upright. This means that to be born at all, humans and human infants must hatch early while they are helpless and totally dependent for many months to come. Haidt, among many other anthropologists, evolutionary psychologists, and social neuroscientists, believe these facts of evolution account for why mothers need help to raise their infants, why human males, to work out their inclusive fitness, become invested in long-term survival of their offspring, and while males continue their sexual consortium with their offspring's mothers and collaborate with them in raising their mutual children. Haidt says this accounts for why a universal feature of human culture is that men and women form relationships intended to last for years, that constrain their sexual behavior and in some way institutionalize their ties to children and to each other. If this seems familiar to you, if this strand of thinking seems familiar to you, I remind you that you heard something very similar to this argument in Lecture 2 when I quoted the 13th century Roman Catholic Thomas Aquinas. But as you'll soon see, Haidt overlooks this strain of Christian thinking and what it means for recognizing the role of attachments in humans and even Christian expressions of love and spirituality. Of course, attachments can become conflicted and not always lead to happiness and well-being. Unhealthy ones can become a cause of anxiety, depression, and obsessive efforts to master them. Haidt recommends the kind of spirituality found in Buddhist meditation, or the cognitive therapy of Aaron Beck, or Prozac, which I don't think I'd classify as a spirituality, but it does some similar effects, to gain release from destructive attachments. Buddhists do this through mindful concentration on their own breathing or some specific object. Beck does this with techniques for breaking destructive thought patterns, such as personalization, overgeneralization, and magnification, and Prozac accomplishes this through chemical effects that can liberate us from dysfunctional attachments and free us from more flexible and satisfying ones. But acknowledging this does not obscure the deeper truth that, according to Haidt and a growing consensus of researchers, that relationships, generally first mediated by the family and then radiating outward to the larger society, get to the core of both happiness and spiritual well-being. This leads him, on the one hand, to recommend Buddhist meditation as a way of breaking troublesome and compulsive attachments, while on the other hand, to criticize both Stoicism and Buddhism for their overall philosophy of renunciation, which includes the eventual detachments from relationships as well. He writes, "The life of cerebral reflection and emotional indifference advocated by Greek and Roman philosophers, and that of calm non-striving advocated by Buddha, are lives designed to avoid passion," by which he means lives designed to avoid emotion. In a life without a passion, and we're justified to add here, emotion is not a human life. Yes, attachments bring pain, but they also bring our greatest joys, and there is value in the very variation that the philosophers are trying to avoid. I detail Haidt's view of Stoic and Buddhist spirituality not to say that he is correct, but to give an example of how he believes science can not only refine the spirituality to the past, but in some cases correct their deficiencies. He does the same with Christian spiritualities. In his discussion of Christian love, Haidt neglects love as caritas and eros, which I discussed and somewhat advocated in the second lecture, and seems to believe that Christian love is always and everywhere interpreted in terms of what I called in that lecture strong, self-sacrificial agape. In his commentary on Jesus' command that you should love your neighbor as yourself, he writes, "And what can it mean to love others as oneself? The psychological origins of love are an attachment to parents and sexual partners. Agape is a Greek word that refers to a kind of selflessness, spiritual love with no sexuality, no clinging to a particular other person. As in Plato, Christian love is stripped of its essential particularity. It's focused on specific persons. Love is remodeled into a general attitude toward a much larger, more infinite class of objects." As we saw in that earlier discussion in Chapter 2, sometimes Christian love was defined in these more abstract terms that gave no recognition to the origins of love and eros, the emotion, and the close attachments which parents, siblings, and extended family. But that was not the case with Thomas Aquinas and the traditions he influenced, and the strong role he gave to kin altruism in the origins of love, and how he envisions its generalization beyond family and kin by virtue of Christianity's recognition that all mankind are kin in the sense of being children of the divine parent, God. We see this as well in Lecture 3 in Ricoeur's appreciation for the formulation of the Golden Rule given by Rabbi Hillel, and where Ricoeur wrote, "I read in Hillel, do not do to your fellow what you hate to have done to you." The phrase, "what you hate having done to you," refers to the emotion of pain. This negative formulation points to the reality that the Jewish and Christian background to the principle of neighbor love was often fully aware of the emotional substructure in the positive experience of attachments and the negative deprivations of isolation, loneliness, and pain. Nor is Haidt aware of the very bodily formulations of neighbor love and the Golden Rule, such as the injunction in Ephesians that says, "In the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. No one ever hates his own body, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it, just as Christ does for the church, because we are members of his body." Haidt approvingly acknowledges at one point that Christianity endorses the love of man and woman in marriage. But then he quickly adds, but even this love is idealized in the love of Christ for the church. This may be idealized, but it is not abstract and without emotion. Within a very few verses from the Ephesians grounds of marriage and Christ's enduring relationship with the church, we hear the very bodily metaphor commanding husbands to love their wives as their own bodies, and to do this in analogy to Christ's bodily union with the church. Analogies of the body pervade Christian understandings of love, and they infuse Christian understandings of community. Maybe Christian love is not always as abstract and idealized as Haidt believes. My purpose, however, here is not to defend Christianity in this particular exchange between science and religion. My aim is to make a much larger methodological point that I introduced in my first lecture. There I made the argument for the priority of the hermeneutic moment in the science-religion dialogue. This dialogue will be most successful when the religious traditions that have shaped our effective histories are first of all understood and interpreted with care. When this happens, these traditions will be seen as complex conversations or dialogues with many different accents and tensions. More times than not, science will help refine opposing positions within a spiritual tradition rather than correcting or even dismantling the tradition as such. Although Haidt and much of positive psychology never explicitly set out to blatantly correct, dismantle, or belittle ancient spiritual traditions, in his strong emphasis upon the value of relationships for healthy spirituality, he ends advancing correctives, substantive correctives, to both Christianity and tradition. In the case of Christianity, because I know it better, I think I successfully can argue that he did not so much correct the abstractness and idealism of its view of love as help reinforce one branch of interpretation in contrast to another within the same tradition. We might be able to present a similar argument with regard to Haidt's interpretation of Buddhism. Not so much that the Buddha was wrong, but that interpreting this tradition's full conversation about the role of relationships in human flourishing is complex. We should be reminded that Buddhism, as is Hinduism, articulate a strong place for the role of the householder stage of life, the role of responsible parenthood, care of one's offspring, and the maintenance of their provisions. In addition, the Buddhist scholar Alan Cole has argued that the true attitude of Buddhism toward relationships, especially family relationships, must be assessed in light of the doctrine of samsara, the wheel of rebirth. Here, even the monk has in his mind on his family, because being a monk earns merit for his mother, father, and siblings, and enables their move as an entire family unit up the ladder of cosmic rebirth and eventual peace. And when the family supports their son and his monastery with gifts and offerings, they are contributing both to his and their ascension in the cycle of rebirth. Hence, the renunciation of attachments in Buddhism is more subtle than one might think. In the context of the full meaning of Buddhism, if we were to follow Alan Cole, what appeared to be renunciations were often indirect enhancements of family attachments at a higher and more cosmic level. So I conclude this discussion by reaffirming that science can help refine and balance traditions. In the case of spirituality, it can and has tended to render our inherited spiritualities more attentive to interworldly values of relationships and work. To the extent that science has done this, it is and can contribute to a revived religious humanism. But this contribution will be most successful if made with an equally careful attempt to understand the complexity and the fullness of these traditions. Scientific understanding of relationships and work will still sound thin and equally abstract unless contextualized by actual felt experiences of attachments and work enriched by the great metaphors of love and vocation that these traditions have delivered to us. It will be best if science does not aspire to replace our spiritual traditions, but enhance and balance them. There are dangers in giving too much play to the interaction between science, Protestantism, and modernization as functioning to push spirituality toward a more inner-worldly sensibility. The sense of transcendence could be lost, and spirituality could gradually be seen only as a means to health, wealth, and general well-being. Science especially can have this impact. As Kenneth Pargament astutely has pointed out, most of the social sciences are undergirded by a form of philosophical pragmatism that measures human action, including religious action, in terms of its practical consequences for human health, wealth, education, and social productivity. To help allay this possibility, the kind of narrowing of spiritual sensibilities, I offer a recommendation. It has to do with the importance of maintaining the double entendre, the double meaning of most spiritual language. To develop this point, I turn to some reflections by Philip Hefner, the longtime editor of Zygon, the leading journal in science religion. Hefner uncovers the double meaning of three New Testament terms central in Christian spirituality. In so doing, he may be giving us insights into how the inner-worldly and more transcendent aspects of spiritual language can be held together. The three Greek words that he's referring to are haimoni, which means to heal or cure, therapeuo, which means to serve or care for, and sososome, meaning to make whole. Hefner points out these terms all share the character of the double entendre. That is, they refer to curing, caring, and wholeness as physical realities, but also at the same time as spiritually transcendent meanings and realities. Here are some examples of what Hefner has in mind. In the Gospel of Matthew, we find the story of the centurion who asked Jesus to heal his servant who was lying at home paralyzed and in terrible distress. Jesus immediately responds by saying, "I will come and cure him." The exchange seems to function, at this point, at the level of physical cure. But then something happens to introduce a new level of meaning. The centurion confesses that he is unworthy to have Jesus visit his house. Instead, he asks Jesus to use his powers to execute the cure from afar, like the centurion does when he gives orders to his troops. Jesus sees in the Roman centurion's response a great act of faith in who Jesus is, a faith that goes beyond anything he has otherwise found in all of Israel. This is an example of how an act of physical cure was also infused with the language of faith and a transcendent power. For another example, take the word sososome, i.e. to make whole. Hefner points out the cognate of this verb is the noun Savior. Hefner tells the story found in Matthew 9:31 about a woman suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years and who touched Jesus' cloak in hopes of being healed. Jesus immediately responds by saying, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you whole." Even in this verse, the physical act of being made whole is mixed with a spiritual act of faith. But in a few passages later, the double meaning of being physically whole and spiritually saved is emphasized even more when Jesus teaches, "For those who want to save their lives will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Hefner points out that the phrase "save their life" contains the Greek word in question, and here has a transcendent spiritual meaning. My point here is that it is difficult to contain the language of healing, care, and wholeness within a strictly inner-worldly frame of reference. Most of us want bodily or physical cure when we are ill, but it is difficult to conceive of our restoration in strictly physical or finite terms. When William James referred to the sense of more, what William James referred to as a sense of more and overbelief very easily slips into our consciousness and our language. James located spiritual experience in our subconscious life. It was the source of our sense of more, our sense of powers beyond ourselves having effects on our consciousness and actions. Freud would have called this more unconscious projection a parental imago. Carl Jung would have explained it as a product of our archetypal inheritance. Cognitive scientists of religion might call it a product of our folk psychological tendencies to assign agency to inanimate objects in the external world, which we can imagine affect our inner life as well. Although James thought this sense of more was the source of spiritual life, he was even more interested in the overbeliefs attached to this sense of more. For him, these overbeliefs were our efforts to interpret and give meaning to the sense of more. James would agree with Ricoeur. Our fascination with scientific explanation should not go so far as to trivialize the meanings and interpretations that communities and individuals have assigned to these overbeliefs. Toward the end of his Varieties of Religious Experience, James wrote, "These ideas will thus be essential to that individual's religion, which is as much as to say that overbeliefs in various directions are absolutely indispensable, and that we should treat them with tenderness and tolerance, so long as they are not intolerant themselves. The most interesting and valuable things about a man are usually his overbeliefs." I must admit that I find both fascinating and disappointing much of what I read in the cognitive sciences about what some call HADD, H-A-D-D, which means hyperactive agency detective device, the experimentally studied tendency of children and even older adults to attribute agency to movements by inanimate objects, such as moving clouds, falling rocks, lightning, and storms, and what this suggests about the possible origin of the idea of God or divine action. I feel as though I gain explanatory insight to the possible origins for ideas about God or divine agency. But this research, it seems to me, teaches me next to nothing about the various meanings or overbeliefs that people associate almost inevitably with ideas about the divine. But as we know, these ideas vary enormously in their respective meanings. And as William James argued, they are not all equal in their philosophical reasonableness, their immediate luminosity, and their moral fruitfulness. His three great tests of the truth and value of religious beliefs and experience, tests that I will discuss more at length in my next lecture. So, to restate a central thesis of these lectures, it is important to keep the balance between our explanatory and interpretive interests so as not to lose the double entendre of spiritual life. We should pursue explanation, but not so dogmatically as to lose interest in the various transcendent meanings of our religious and spiritual experience. This is especially true for those who have an interest in what I have argued is one of the most promising cultural contributions of the science-religion dialogue, the possible revival of religious humanism. Early in this lecture, I argued that the scientific study of religion was influenced, along with other social factors, modern forms of spirituality toward more inner-worldly concerns with human connections, issues of work and vocation, and practical reason. So far, I have not talked about the links between spirituality and practical reason. Much of the scientific work linking spirituality and practical reason has been suggestive, but not definitive. Work on the benefits of mindfulness or even mystical experiences suggests these states may contribute to loosening ego boundaries, disrupting rigid thought patterns, and thereby freeing practical reason to be more effective. But without a more detailed work on the nature of practical reason, evidence that some experiences may make us freer and more flexible in our practical wisdom actually tell us very little about the relationship between spirituality and practical reason. it might prove helpful to examine some classic examples of the interaction of practical reason and spirituality. On this subject, I build once again on some insightful work by spirituality scholar Claire Wolfdyke on the writings of Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius' life paralleled Luther and Calvin and was part of the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation. Born to a noble Spanish family with high aspirations for secular fame and honor, after being wounded in battle and an intense period of reading and reflection, he wrote his famous spiritual exercises and used them to form the Society of Jesus, commonly referred to as the Jesuits. His order was not modeled on the Benedictine emphasis upon the cloister or the mendicant model of living off of alms. It emphasized more a life of service and the ordering of the priorities of life built on the goals of mission. Time and again, Ignatius recognized the interworldly goals of marriage and career, family and work, not unlike so many contemporary spiritualities. Ignatius seemed to understand that marriage and family, as well as work and career, would be natural pursuits for many people. He advised pursuing them, however, with an air of indifference so that we would not become overly attached to these finite goods. Ignatius spoke of disordered attachments, not unlike the attachment theorists of today. In order to keep our interworldly attachments from becoming disordered, Ignatius taught that there needed to be a proper order in our practical reason on the relationship of means to ends. Family and the benefits of work and career should be treated as finite and relative means that should be guided by a greater end. In one place, Ignatius writes, "Hence, whatever I choose should help me to the end for which I am created, not ordering or drawing the end to the means, but the means to the end. Many persons first choose marriage, which is a means, and secondarily the service of God our Lord in marriage, though the service of God is the end. So also others first choose to earn an income, and afterwards to serve God through it. Such persons do not go directly to God, but want God to come to their disordered attachments. Consequently, they make the end a means, and of the means an end. So what they ought to seek first, they seek last. Therefore, my first aim should be to seek to serve God, which is the end, and only after that, if it is more profitable to earn an income or to marry, to form a family, for these are means to the end." This remarkable passage demonstrates a thick view of practical reason, not far from the multidimensional view that I outlined in Lecture 3 and associated with Paul Ricoeur. Family and work become pre-moral goods that we are entitled to calculate about and pursue if we do so flexibly with a degree of detachment. At this level, Ignatius could have a conversation with Jonathan Haidt about the spirituality of human connections and work. But whereas Haidt pretty much makes human connections and work the ends of spirituality, Ignatius relativizes these goods to a higher principle, the service of God. Ignatius would be, in fact, at odds with most of the modern scientific study of spirituality, which often measures spirituality by the degree to which it serves what Ignatius would call the means of health, human connections, vocational success, and wealth, rather than by some wider principle that would coordinate these relative goods in service of a higher and more general good. But Ignatius' principle of service to God is actually thickened by a narrative that surrounds it. The exercise for weeks 3 and 4 of his program centered around the narrative of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Serving God, a principle that should guide our pursuit of the finite goods of family and work, meant for Ignatius recapitulating the story about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But even then, Ignatius summarized the meaning of Jesus' life with a formulation of the meaning of Christian love, a formulation not unlike the principle of caritas that I spoke favorably about in Lecture 2. The concrete meaning of glorifying God is to live life according to mutual love. It is mutual love that should guide our pursuit of human connections and the rewards and meanings of our daily toil. And the rhythms of sacrifice and resurrection are implicit in the dynamics of mutual love. Ignatius wrote, "Love consists in mutual sharing among persons. For example, as a lover gives and shares with the beloved what he or she possesses or has to give and has to give up. And vice versa, the beloved shares with the lover. Thus, if one has knowledge, it should be shared with the one who does not. And so also with honors or riches, so one is always sharing with others." It offers examples of spirituality from Ignatius as a case study in how spirituality and practical reason can work hand in hand. It's also a spirituality that affirms the finite goods of human connections and work. Ignatius ordered these goods with a practical reason guided by the narrative of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection summarized by the principle of mutual love. It is this story and the idea of mutual love that transforms the quest for human connections into the mutual love of family life, work, and a wider social philosophy. And it is mutual love that transforms our family and work life into a vocation that also serves the greater good. We must continue to read the classics of Western and world spirituality for what they contribute to the realization of the finite goods of life and the transformation of these goods into a wider and more general good for all. The tension between these two levels of meaning, the double entendre, is worthy, I submit, of continued study and understanding by both the natural sciences and the normative disciplines of philosophy and theology. Thank you very much. I guess question and answer time. Sit down.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
Nat, you're going to mediate here?
We have time for some questions from the audience. This microphone is for recording purposes only. It doesn't amplify your voice, but if you have a question, please wait for me to get the microphone to you first. So any questions for Dr. Browning? I have a question.
Okay. Break the ice.
You were talking a lot about the double meaning of some of these words, the spiritual and physical, and you're talking about the double entendre. And actually, last night I had the privilege and pleasure of talking with you about another doubleness having to do with spirituality, and that's the double-edged character of spirituality, and that it can instigate or enhance experience of the premoral goods that are vital to practical reasoning, but it can also undercut the motivations to be an agent for change. And we talked about this in particular with relation to mystical kinds of spirituality. And I was wondering if maybe you could comment on this double-edged character, especially with regard to Haidt's criticisms of Buddhism and Christianity. I mean, it is possible that he's registering that other edge of the spiritual.
Well, he certainly, I think, is what he perceives himself to do. And my response would be, he may be justified with regard to some strands of the interpretation of those traditions, but not necessarily all strands. And so my argument is that he promotes his argument to be more blanket and all-encompassing of those traditions than I think he's justified in doing. So that's why I say he's helping us refine the dialogue within the traditions, but not necessarily correcting the traditions. He's throwing the ball in one direction more than the other direction. But he doesn't know the traditions, or he doesn't attend to the traditions. He's a pretty smart guy. I don't want to rat on Jonathan Haidt. But for a young man like this, I think he does a remarkable job of handling some of these traditions. But he has a little bit more confidence in the critical powers of science to actually set the traditions straight in a more encompassing way. But yes, one can interpret strands of Buddhism, and that's certainly been done in such a way as to totally relativize attachments in such a way that you might not find them important at all, or even subject matters for transformation. And certainly I tend to think that certain doctrines of Christian love can be interpreted that way. And certain views of mystical experience can be seen to broaden experience, loosen ego boundaries, make us more open, but give us very little guidance as to more specific handling and modeling, hierarchizing of what I call premoral goods. But there are other forms of mystical experience which are attached but very interesting and complex mediating factors between the religious experience and more concrete things. So you kind of got to do what I think I tried in a very cursory way to do with Ignatius. Kind of read the text. You got to look at what they're really saying in totality with some care.
On the subject of Ignatius, I mean, do you think that the spiritual end manages to integrate all of the various humanistic goods of life, or do you think is that an ideal? I mean, it's always possible that the spiritual end displaces some of these other goods.
I tend to think that most spiritual ends come with a narrative surround. So it's just not some isolated thing, like, transcendent relationship with God, or a mystical experience of union. There's a story that surrounds it. And that story and narrative about the place of that experience in a larger view of life often, not always, but often has great integrational power. I tend to think, for instance, that with regard to the Christian narrative, the doctrine of creation, to me, tells me that all of creation are premoral goods. Creation is good. You take it all seriously, and you cherish it, and you honor it as products of goods. A lot of people don't quite understand that that's a very strong dimension of Christian faith. Now, there are two complicating factors: the sinfulness of human agency and the fact that even good things can compete in conflict, even if there wasn't such a thing as sin. They can still conflict. So there has to be another move in the narrative toward God the governor. And here's where you begin to see the more moral tests begin to emerge. And then finally, even the doctrines of salvation, forgiveness, and reconciliation that you find more associated with the New Testament have a lot to do with the renewal of human life and our fumbling and stirring. So you look at the narrative as a whole, it has ordering power. And look at the content of the narrative. And that would be true for other traditions. But if you isolate just one aspect of the narrative and make too much out of that, it can be very misleading, I think.
Thank you. I wonder if you could help me think better about the extremes of spirituality relative to the impetus that you have noted for wholeness. There's some spiritual people that are pretty crazy if you're applying senses of balance. They don't live life in such a way as to have friends and connections. They sometimes get themselves cut off. Their experiences are extreme. The metaphors that they use are push things. You think of Teresa of Avila being ravished by God, Or think about William Cowper, the 18th century English poet and hymn writer. He was in and out of mental institutions all of his life, but he was known to be one of the most deeply spiritual people there. His hymns that talk about there is a fountain filled with blood that flowed from Emmanuel's veins. Freudians would get a kick out of that, but there's something really intense about that. Now, should we apply a kind of Aristotelian eudaimonistic ethics to say that that's extreme or crazy? Or is it the case that spirituality means connections with things that are wild?
Well, as you, I think it's really hard to improve. I'll say more about them in tonight's lecture. I think it's tonight, about the three criteria that James used. He wanted to pay close attention to even the crazies, or what we would call, at the first glance, the crazies. He wanted their spirituality to get into the conversation, to be part of what was taken seriously. And he wanted to make sure that we didn't completely measure those spiritualities by origins or pathological associations. And that's where the criterion of moral usefulness is, and it's a bigger concept than we might tend to think. I'll try to elaborate that this evening. And that's another reason why I like to handle spirituality within the context of traditions, because the traditions themselves have critical resources for measuring the margins and saying, oh, this goes a little bit too far, or this goes a little bit far. But at the same time, I do not hesitate in subordinate ways to use science, because science can throw light on the other criterion that James developed, and that is philosophical reasonableness, consistency with other known aspects of experience. As long as you don't handle that foundationally, it can still be very useful. So yes, religion needs critique, and spiritualities need critique, and crazy spiritualities need critique. But that doesn't always mean they just get thrown out the door just because they look a little bizarre. And so I think developing James's categories can be pretty useful. And there's a eudaimonistic aspect to that. And moral usefulness has a lot to do with elements of human fulfillment and flourishing. Yeah.
What is your definition of spirituality?
Pardon?
What is your definition of spirituality?
Well, I advanced the definition, I think, in one of the earlier lectures, and that is spirituality, in the broadest sense, is defined by one's relationship with what one considers to be sacred. And there I added the word, or a couple of qualifications. The sacred often has a kind of stabilizing character that breaks up means in calculations, cost-benefit analysis, and say, whoop, you can't think that way about everything in life. There are a few things that stop the calculative mentality. Now, a former student of mine was in the audience when I said that night, and he came up afterwards and he said to me, Chris Schlau said to me, Don, do you think that you make the moral the sacred? Because that particular lecture, I was making a big deal out of the moral. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good question, especially in light of the lecture that I just gave. But I don't consider myself making the moral the sacred. I consider the sacred to be found in the narrative surround, which gives meaning to our morality and some of our justification. Like I illustrated a few minutes ago, the doctrine of creation, giving us an additional metaphorical way of thinking about the goodness of life and the goodness of free moral values. And the sacred to me would be seen in various moments of a religious tradition's narrative And since I'm a Christian, why I could illustrate that best around my view of the Christian narrative. That address.
I'm very interested in how you're juxtaposing practical reason and spirituality. And in my experience, that juxtaposition is not something that many people who gravitate to spirituality would articulate. So I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about how your understanding of the relationship between practical reason and spirituality might inform how we think about spiritual formation, or how we think about theological education and the cultivation of practical reason as being one of the ends of that.
By the way, this is Claire Wolfteich, in case you didn't know, whom I quoted twice. I think you're right that there's not a huge amount of talk everywhere, formal talk. Let's make it formal talk, explicit talk about the relationship of spirituality and practical reason. I did mention two examples of perspectives that would get on the edges of it, like the relationship of spirituality to breaking attachments and loosening our ego boundaries and making it possible for us to think better in that sense. But that's just the opening of the conversation and not the end of it. But I think a lot of the kind of thing that happens in the dialogue between spirituality and psychotherapy, between spirituality and positive psychology, opens up to the edges of that conversation of the relationship of spirituality and practical reason. And we just need to take it farther. And I think informally, an awful lot of people think they're getting practical guidance in their spirituality. You know, I went to God and I prayed and came back and he told me, I remember one sad story about this woman who was trying to decide whether she should try to pursue this marriage relationship. Well, she'd already decided to try to pursue this relationship and turn it into marriage. Quite clear. Her prayer to God was, deliver him unto me. Give him to me. And when the guy pulled out, she was deeply disillusioned with God. So God, she thought, would both tell her what to do and deliver the object of her wishes. So that's implicitly a kind of a theory of the relationship of practical reason and spirituality, I think a defective one. So I think there's a lot of that kind of thing out there, which probably needs to be cleaned up a little bit. And but I think you're right. Formally, it has not progressed as far as it should. There are exceptions, and you've contributed to it. But it hasn't gone as far as I think it could.
Going back to Ignatius and his process of discernment, it is based on the principle of the virtue of prudence. So there is implicit in that a moral foundation. You had suggested that he gives an indifference in the sense of, as an area of indifference, as a posture that you take, and the translation of that indifference, in my understanding, creates a detachment to have discernment within discernment of spirits.
The what?
Discernment of spirits. So you are discerning between movements of spirits as he articulates his consolations and desolations. So we are always challenged by how do we know what we know and how do we discern? And that in that process, do you feel that he might offer, through spirituality, a practical reason or a practical way to have decision making?
Yeah, and I think you're undoubtedly right, and I probably should have and could have made more out of the role of the Spirit in Ignatius. But I was struck by the actual content about how the Spirit works through the narrative of the Christian story and through his understanding of mutual love, which he develops into a pretty substantive moral issue, animated and empowered by the Christian narrative. So discernment seems to me not to be quite as mystical as one might think when you actually see what a fairly robust role he gives to the narrative itself and the way he interprets mutual love in light of the narrative. So there's some, excuse me, I'm talking like a philosopher, I guess I have biases there. There's content there. You know, there's stuff that you can actually get your finger on as to how it might work. And it's not just, you know, I'm going to pray to God and get some discernment through the Spirit. The Spirit is consistent with that narrative and consistent with that view of mutual love if I'm reading those texts with some degree of accuracy. I get a little bit nervous when with those spiritualities which just talk about discernment and there's a kind of a vacuous character to them and they disconnect from the narrative, they disconnect from the ethic and the tradition, and as if all that is not working in their minds when they're trying to discern. My point of view is it's very definitely probably working in their minds when they're trying to discern. And discernment is a prayerful way of sorting that out. And sure, they can maybe be in communication with God and the Spirit, but it's not just like, oh, the Spirit is working and God's infusing my heart and I've forgotten everything else I know about the tradition. No, these two things, I think, are interacting.
Your parting thought in this lecture this afternoon was to encourage us to continue thinking about this difference between ultimate spiritual ends and proximate means of satisfaction, and how both traditions and the sciences could have an impact on our thinking. I appreciate that point, but there are a lot of people today who reject the necessity of an ultimate spiritual end to regulate and relativize the various means of satisfaction that we have. So I'd like you to design, in a kind of thought experiment, what an actual experiment using the sciences might look like to help us decide between which of these two groups is correct. One group says it's necessary to have an ultimate spiritual end in order to relativize and coordinate these goods. The other group says it's simply necessary to aim at limiting factors like mental and physical health, and you don't need an ultimate end to organize everything. Could you tell us an experiment?
I'm not so sure I can whip up a good experiment right off the bat, but it seems to me like that could be researchable, and you've absolutely caught the note that I kind of ended the lecture on. Before we completely reduce spirituality to what it does for our health, wealth, education, vocations, and so on, let's look at the saturation of spiritual traditions with double entendre, and let's see how that tends to work. It seems to me that there are different kinds of people who think of their spirituality in very utilitarian terms. And it seems to me we would be able to find ways of studying what that really does for them with realizing their proximate goals and keeping a balance. And I think we can probably find other kinds of people that actually have some way in which they pursue these goals, but also see them as relativized, transcended, and organized by some larger framework. It seems to me that could be studied. It may have been studied. I don't know. Like a lot of these things, it takes a lot of tricks in the bags of scientists, but a lot of scientists are very clever in finding ways to do that. So I'm holding out the hypothesis it's the kind of thing that could be inquired into. And it's also, I think, just useful to go back to the texts themselves, as I tried to do in that case study of Ignatius, and see how that works. And it's kind of surprising to see him take family relationships and work so seriously. I mean, like I say, he could have a conversation with Haidt, Cassioppo, a whole bunch of contemporary people, Pargament, but he suddenly puts it all into a larger context, not denying those goods, but transforming them into larger frameworks and larger goals that have social philosophical relevance. The kingdom of God and kingdom of God's intentions are certainly about a more general good than just our work and our family.
I wonder if you'd respond to an hypothesis that I'd offer. If we were actually to run this research study, I'd predict that any difference that appeared between the two groups could be traceable entirely to the density of the narrative, that the group with the say overarching ultimate end, that the narrative they had at their disposal would be able to be it would be more powerful in focusing their attention, in marshalling their resources and so on, but not in terms of actual behaviour, not in terms of actual satisfaction would there be any difference. Now, would you respond to that?
Well, I think you're probably right, that the density of the narrative is important, but let's realize that even the people who deny they have a narrative probably do have a narrative. I tend to think it's awfully hard to escape some kind of overarching narrative about the meaning of life. It may not be recognizable in terms of certain classic traditions. It's probably there. So that would have to be looked at too. And of course, some of those narratives for more so-called secular types may, in part, almost by definition, be relatively thin and inchoate. But not all the religious people are going to have cohesive ones either. And some are going to be pretty mamby-pamby, and some of them are going to be pretty coherent. And some are going to be dogmatic. And how to differentiate those things would be part of the task. So this is the limitations of a person who's primarily a theologian and not a working social psychologist. But it seems to me it's researchable at several different levels. I must tell you that in the name of brevity, I left out a whole long section on the double entendres that function in psychotherapy. So it's there in the manuscript, and if you ever want to look at it, well, you can buy the book when it comes out. I think you see it all over psychotherapy.
Well, I think that wraps up our question and answer session for the first lecture. We're having the second one at 7:30. In the same place, and I hope you all come back and join us for that. But once again, join me in thanking Dr. Browning for this first lecture.
Thank you.